He had known for 6 months. He had prepared for 6 months. And when the moment finally came, he gave her a smile that cost him nothing, because everything had already been moved. You'll understand it completely by the end.
The restaurant smelled like garlic butter and ambient jazz, the kind of place where the waitstaff refill your water without being asked, and the lighting is designed to make everyone look softer than they are. I remember that detail because I spent most of the evening noticing things. The angle of Vivian's shoulder, the way she kept her phone face down on the table, the careful precision with which she ordered the duck confit she didn't actually want, a choice made for effect, I realized later, because she needed to appear composed. It was my 36th birthday. I had booked the table myself 2 weeks earlier using the app we shared. She had confirmed. She had even sent a text the morning of, "Tonight's going to be perfect," that I read 3 times before I put my phone down and went to the gym. I knew what tonight was, and I had known for 6 months. The papers were in her bag. I could tell from the way she kept touching the clasp, a small unconscious pat, the way someone checks their pocket for keys before leaving the house. She was nervous. She had practiced this. Whatever she was going to say had been rehearsed in front of a mirror, or possibly in front of Dominic, who had been coaching her, I later confirmed, on exactly how to present this in a way that would seem reasonable. Nothing about it was reasonable. But I smiled when she pulled the envelope out. I smiled because I had already moved everything. I'll tell you exactly how. 6 months before that birthday dinner, I woke up at 4:47 in the morning to the sound of Vivian's phone buzzing on the nightstand, not ringing, buzzing, silent mode vibration. That's the kind you activate when you don't want a sound to wake someone but still need to receive the message. She was asleep, or she appeared to be asleep. I have since catalogued the difference. The breathing pattern is slightly off when someone is pretending, a fraction too controlled, a fraction too deliberate. I lay still for 11 minutes. The phone buzzed twice more. I did not reach for it. I got up, went to the bathroom, and stood at the mirror for a while. I was not angry. That would come later, in a different form. Not rage, more like a structural reckoning, a recalibration of every assumption I had built the last 4 years on. But at 4:47 on a Tuesday morning in March, I was simply noting the fact. Something was wrong. The question was, how wrong, since when, and what exactly? I want to say something about Vivian before I go any further, because the story is not fully told without it. She was, when I met her, one of the most self-possessed people I had encountered. Not cold. There was warmth in her. Specific and real, the kind that emerged in small moments rather than grand ones. The way she remembered the particular coffee preference of every person she had more than 2 conversations with. The way she could sit in a room and understand its emotional climate within 4 minutes. The way she laughed at things that were actually funny rather than performing laughter at things that were supposed to be. I had met her at a professional event, a design conference I attended mostly out of obligation. She was there representing the firm she worked with at the time, an interiors consultancy. We talked for an hour, and then we found a bar and talked for 3 more. She had strong opinions about things that most people didn't have strong opinions about. Buildings, music, why certain cities work and others don't. She was not performing the opinions. She had simply thought about things. I found that rare. We were together for a year before we married, and the year was good in the way that early things are good, vivid and specific, with the quality of genuine attention that the beginning of something important tends to produce. I paid attention to her. She paid attention to me. We built a language, the private one that couples develop, shorthand and shared reference and small rituals that accumulate into something that begins to feel like a structure. I believed in that structure. 4 years later, when I was standing at the bathroom mirror at 4:47 in the morning, reconsidering the foundation. I am an architect by training and a project developer by profession. I work through Aldercroft, the firm I co-founded with a partner 7 years ago, and the discipline that profession has given me. The methodical reading of structures, the understanding that a crack in one place usually indicates stress in another, transferred directly to what happened next. I did not confront Vivian. Not that morning, not that week. Confrontation was not the tool I needed. Confrontation would have triggered her defenses, pushed information underground, and handed her the moral leverage of the wrongfully accused. Even if she was guilty, which I believed she was, a confrontation before I had evidence would have given her time to rewrite the narrative. I had watched that happen to a colleague years before. His wife had an affair. He confronted. She cried. He apologized. A year later, she left anyway, and because he had confronted without evidence and then retreated, the emotional and legal positioning had shifted entirely in her favor. He arrived at the end of that marriage having absorbed the blow twice, once when the affair was ongoing, and again when the settlement arrived and he was operating in reaction mode, without preparation, without documentation, without a clean picture of what he was actually protecting. I was not going to repeat that. Instead, I went to work. The first thing I documented was pattern change. I kept a small notebook, physical, not digital, and for the first 2 weeks I recorded only time-based observations: when she left the house, when she returned, of phone usage patterns, as I could observe them from adjacent rooms without accessing the device itself, energy levels in the evenings compared to mornings, the frequency and duration of events, girls' nights and work drinks and yoga sessions, that had escalated from occasional to weekly to near constant over the preceding 3 months. I did not write anything interpretive, only facts, timestamps, durations, frequencies. By the end of 2 weeks, the pattern was unmistakable. There were 3 evenings per week, reliably, when she returned 40 minutes to an hour later than stated. The variance was small enough to suggest routine, but large enough to suggest the activity was not incidental. It required a specific window of time. The yoga explanation had accounted for one of those evenings. The other 2 were attributed to work, to friends, to the low specificity explanations that you do not question when you are not yet asking questions. I was asking questions now. I did not know what filled that window. Not yet. The second tool I used was a professional one. Through Aldercroft, I had long-standing relationships with a legal firm called Hargrove and Associates. We had used them for contract review, compliance work, employment disputes, and on one occasion, an ugly dispute with a subcontractor that nearly went to litigation. They knew our business. More importantly, they knew me. I called their senior partner, Gideon, directly on his personal line. Gideon was 61 years old, had been practicing family and corporate law for 33 years, and had the particular manner of someone who has heard everything and is surprised by nothing. Yet he wore the same style of suit in 3 different colors, and drank tea that he made himself in a small electric kettle on his desk. He had the slow, considered speech of someone who has learned that most conversations go better when the other person finishes their thought before you start yours. I told him I needed a conversation that was privileged, preliminary, and entirely off-record. He said, "Come in Thursday. I'll clear the afternoon." We met for 2 hours at his office, which smelled like the particular combination of old paper and radiator heat that characterizes buildings that have been well used for decades. I told him what I knew, what I suspected, and what I did not yet know. He listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he placed his teacup down and said, "You've done this before?" I told him I hadn't. You're thinking like someone who has, he said. Most men come in here 2 weeks after the fact, when she's already filed and they're operating in reaction. You're here before. That's the entire ballgame. He told me 4 things I needed to know before any formal process began. First, document everything, but selectively. Certain types of documentation, digital surveillance, for example, have evidentiary value in some jurisdictions and legal liability in others. He advised on exactly which methods were permissible and which were not. Second, understand the marital asset structure with precision. Every account, every asset, every investment vehicle. Not approximately. Exactly. Third, do nothing financially unusual or large in a way that could appear to be dissipation of marital assets. Any movement had to be structured correctly, is timed correctly, and justifiable as normal business activity. Fourth, begin the separation of personal and marital finances in ways that were entirely legal and entirely difficult to reverse, not for concealment, for protection. I took notes in the physical notebook. I left Gideon's office and sat in my car for 20 minutes before driving home. The car park at his building was partly underground, and the particular quality of fluorescent light in an underground car park at 6 in the evening, flat and without warmth, the kind that makes everything look slightly more fragile than it is, matched the state of my thinking. I sat with it. Then I drove home, and Vivian had made dinner, and we ate it, and I listened to her describe an argument she'd had with a colleague, and I asked the right questions. And afterward we watched television for an hour before she said she was tired. I said I'd be up soon. I stayed on the sofa for another 2 hours. The asset conversation came next. And this is where I need to be specific, because the specificity is the entire point. Vivian and I had been married for 4 years. Before the marriage, I had spent 9 years building Aldercroft from a 2-man architectural practice into a firm with a development arm, 17 full-time employees, and a project portfolio that had crossed the £8 million mark in annual revenue. The business existed before the marriage. That mattered, legally. The value accumulated prior to the marriage was, under most conventional frameworks, considered a non-marital asset, though this was not absolute. And the commingling of personal and business finances during the marriage could create complications that a motivated legal team could exploit. Aldercroft had grown significantly during the 4 years of our marriage. Growth during a marriage is often treated differently from premarital value. Vivian's legal team, whoever she would eventually engage, would almost certainly argue that a portion of that growth was marital property, subject to division. The question was how large a portion they could credibly claim. Gideon introduced me to a financial forensics specialist named Elena, who worked in a consultancy adjacent to his firm. Elena was 44, efficient, and spoke about money with the flat precision of someone reading weather data. She had an ability to reduce complicated financial pictures to 3 sentences and a number. And the number was always the right one. Over 3 meetings in her office, which smelled like fresh coffee and carpet cleaner, and had the particular utilitarian quality of a space where people come to solve problems rather than impress each other, we mapped the full picture. My personal accounts, joint accounts, Vivian's individual accounts as far as I had legal access to observe, investment portfolios, pension funds, the equity in our shared home, 2 buy-to-let properties that had been purchased jointly during the marriage, and a significant share package tied to a development project that had matured 6 months earlier. The share package was the key issue. It had been awarded as part of a development partnership pre-marriage, but had matured, vested fully during the marriage. whilst the legal treatment of that value was genuinely ambiguous. Somewhere between £200,000 and £300,000, depending on current market valuation, sat in a contested zone. Elena was precise. You need that reclassified before any proceedings begin. If it's still sitting as a joint accessible asset when she files, you'll spend 18 months and a considerable sum of legal fees arguing about it. If it's correctly structured before she files, the argument becomes significantly smaller. Gideon confirmed the legal mechanism. The share package had been awarded to me personally, in my name, pre-marriage, as part of a professional contract with a development partner. The fact that it vested during the marriage did not automatically make it marital property. What mattered was the source and the contractual basis, as the mechanism was to have the original awarding contract reviewed and formally annotated by Hargrove, establishing the pre-marital basis for the award. This was not the creation of a fiction. It was the proper legal documentation of an existing fact. The kind of documentation that should have existed from the beginning and simply hadn't been formalized. Contracts often don't contain the level of annotation that later legal processes require. Making them complete is not deceptive. It's due diligence. It took 6 weeks of paperwork, multiple meetings between Gideon's team and the development partner who had issued the original award, and 2 formal legal opinions. At the end of those 6 weeks, the share package had a clear, documented, legally annotated paper trail establishing its pre-marital origin. It had been moved, correctly, into an individual holding structure in my name, with formal Hargrove notation. £240,000, properly documented. The buy-to-let properties were a different matter. Both properties had been purchased jointly during the marriage, using a combination of personal savings and mortgage debt. Under any reasonable framework, these were marital assets. I did not attempt to reclassify them. What I did was understand their precise current value, which required independent valuations, commissioned through a firm with no prior relationship to either of us, and cross-reference those valuations against the outstanding mortgage balances and the relative capital contributions each of us had made to the purchase. My capital contribution had been significantly larger, 68% of the total invested capital, and as documented in bank transfer records that had existed since the day the transactions were made. The documentation existed. It simply needed to be organized. Elena spent 4 hours organizing it. She was methodical in the way that people who truly understand their domain are methodical, not laboriously careful, but efficient, moving through documents with the speed of someone who knows exactly what they're looking for and recognizes it immediately. When she was done, she had a complete contribution analysis with sourcing documentation, timeline annotations, and current valuation reports for both properties. It did not reclassify the properties as non-marital. It accurately established the capital contribution ratio. In a settlement negotiation, that ratio matters. It supports a case for an unequal distribution of the net proceeds that reflects the actual investment, rather than a default 50-50 split that ignores the documented financial history. Gideon reviewed it. This is the clearest picture I've seen from a pre-filing client in 15 years. She's going to be arguing against a wall. I told him I hadn't decided to file yet. No, he said, but you'll be ready when she does. The broader Aldercroft structure required its own attention. The firm had a shareholders' agreement, as all properly constituted companies do. But the agreement had been drafted in the early years, when the priority was getting the practice operational, and it contained certain ambiguities that would have created complications in a marital dispute. Specifically, it did not explicitly address the pre-marital origin of my stake. the valuation methodology for my share in the event of any external claim, or the ring-fencing of pre-marital goodwill from the calculation of current business value. Gideon commissioned a specialist corporate solicitor within his network to review and revise the shareholders' agreement. The revisions were presented to my co-founding partner, a measured, practical man who had understood immediately what the exercise was about, and he had agreed, without extensive discussion, that properly documented agreements were in everyone's interest. The revised agreement was signed in the 4th week of May. It did not change the underlying facts. It documented them precisely, in language that was legally unambiguous, and in a format that would serve as the definitive record in any subsequent inquiry. The Aldercroft stake, valued through an independent business appraisal commissioned by Hargrove, was £1.4 million. Of that value, the independent appraiser was asked to separate Putsua premarital and marital period growth using documented revenue records, project histories, and industry benchmarks. Their conclusion: approximately 1.1 million of that value traced to premarital establishment and growth. The marital period contribution to value, the growth that occurred during the 4 years of the marriage, was approximately 300,000. That 300,000 was the number a competent opposing legal team could credibly argue was a marital asset. It was not a small number, but it was a fraction of the 1.4 million that, mine without documentation, would have appeared simply as his business, valued at 1.4 million, acquired during or significantly grown during the marriage. The documentation reduced the exposure by more than £1 million. It was the 4th week of April, 8 weeks after the nightstand buzzing, when I learned Dominic's name. I had not hired a private investigator. Gideon had advised caution there. Certain forms of private investigation create evidentiary problems rather than solving them, and the last thing I needed was a procedural complication contaminating a clean financial process. What I had done, with his guidance on permissibility, was access the call logs that were visible through our shared phone plan account. We were on a family plan. The account holder was me. The plan documentation, which I had kept, established my access rights clearly. I did not read message content. I noted call frequencies and durations. One number appeared with increasing regularity, 14 times in 2 weeks, calls averaging 11 minutes. A business number, as it turned out. The registered business was an interior design consultancy. The director of that consultancy was a man named Dominic. I looked him up professionally. His consultancy was called Wyndham Studio. He had been operating for 4 years, ran a modest client portfolio, worked primarily in residential renovation. He was 38. He had been married once before. The marriage had ended 18 months ago. He was not a remarkable person, professionally or otherwise. And he was the kind of person who acquires significance not from his own qualities, but from the attachment someone else places on him. The significance he carried for Vivian was hers, not his. He was the container for a decision she had already made. A decision that had started, I believed, not with Dominic specifically, but with a general withdrawal, a private conclusion about the marriage that she had reached on her own, possibly accurately, and had not told me about. I filed the information. I did not act on it. I went home and we had dinner, and Vivian told me about a client she was excited about, and I listened, and afterward we went to sleep. The next part requires explaining a decision I made that some people, hearing it, might find difficult to understand. I continued the marriage normally for another 4 months, and I went home each evening. I had dinner with Vivian 3 or 4 nights a week, as we always had. I traveled for work when work required it. I bought her flowers once, as I had occasionally done since early in the marriage, Not more frequently than before, and not less. I attended a dinner party at friends in May and talked normally and drove us home. I did not change my behavior toward her in any observable way. This was not performance for its own sake, and it was not a trap. It was strategy. Every change in behavior telegraphs awareness. Awareness triggers countermoves. Countermoves muddy the asset picture, accelerate informal conversations with legal advisors, create discrepancies in the record that complicate the clean documentation I was building. The single greatest advantage I had was that Vivian did not know I knew. That advantage was worth preserving for exactly as long as it took to complete the financial preparation. The other reason, which I will be honest about, I needed to be sure. Not about the affair. The evidence of that was, by May, quite clear. The call records, the pattern changes, the small observable signs that accumulate when someone is managing a parallel life. I was not in doubt about what was happening. But I needed to be sure about my own position. I had spent 9 years building Aldercroft. I had married with genuine intention. I did not want to move on the basis of a 3-month picture when 6 months of documentation would give me a foundation that no process could challenge. The certainty was not about forgiveness or hope. It was about the difference between a good position and a complete one. In June, on 6 weeks before the birthday, I completed the final financial preparation step. The share package documentation was in place. The asset register was complete. The 2 buy-to-let properties had been independently valued, and the contribution records were organized. The Aldercroft ownership structure had been reviewed by Gideon, the shareholders' agreement was signed, and the independent business appraisal had been received, reviewed, and filed. Beyond documentation, I had made one active structural decision. Elena had identified that a significant portion of my liquid savings, approximately £90,000, accumulated from personal income over the previous 3 years, was sitting in a joint account. Not because Vivian had any formal claim to it. The deposits were from my salary and business distributions, was not from any shared source, but the account was joint. Its accessibility was joint. In an adversarial process, money in a joint account is presumptively accessible to both parties. The fact that the money was mine by source did not prevent it from being frozen, contested, or factored into a broader negotiation in ways that were inconvenient. The mechanism was straightforward. I opened a personal account in my name only, at a different institution from our joint accounts. Over 8 weeks, I moved the $90,000 in small, regular transfers, each framed within normal personal expense management patterns. I documented each transfer meticulously. For each, I noted the date, the amount, the account of origin, the account of destination, and a brief note on the rationale, personal savings management, yet separation of individually sourced funds. The documentation was clean, consistent, and entirely explainable. At the end of June, the joint account contained normal operating funds, bill payments, shared expenses, the kind of money that legitimately belonged to both of us. The accumulated personal savings were in my name only, at a separate institution. Elena reviewed the complete picture. This is exactly what I'd advise any client with individually sourced assets to do, she said. You're not hiding anything. You're correctly attributing personal earnings to a personal account. If anyone questions it, the documentation answers every question. Gideon agreed. It's not concealment. It's organization. There's a meaningful legal difference. I thanked them both. I paid Elena's invoice from the personal account, but I paid Gideon's retainer from the personal account. I went home and made pasta, which Vivian and I ate at the kitchen table while she told me about a design project she was considering, and I listened and asked the right questions and refilled her wine glass. And afterward we watched something on television, and she fell asleep on the sofa, and I sat there for a while in the quiet. I need to describe what those months cost, because this story will read like a chess match, and chess matches are clean, and this was not entirely clean. There were evenings in early May when I sat on the edge of the bed in the guest room. I had begun sleeping there 2 nights a week, citing poor sleep, which she accepted without comment, and felt the full weight of it. Not the anger, the grief, at the specific grief of understanding that the version of your life you had believed you were living was a construction, and that you had built half of it yourself from materials that turned out not to be real. I had wanted this marriage. I had chosen Vivian because she was sharp and self-possessed, and funny in a way that was never obvious, and because she made me feel, in the early years, genuinely, like someone who had made a good decision. There is a particular warmth in the feeling of having chosen well, and losing it is its own specific loss. Not dramatic, just accurate. The guest room had a radiator that clicked when the heating came on. I noticed that sound more than I noticed most sounds in those months, a small, regular percussion that marked the passage of time in a room I was not supposed to be occupying. And I allowed myself to feel the grief, in there, in the dark. And then I turned the light on, and I went back to the notebook. By early July, the preparation was complete. I had told Gideon in our last substantive meeting before his summer holiday that I expected the filing to come by autumn. What I did not know, because I did not have the full picture yet, was that she would choose my birthday. I found out about that particular choice 3 weeks before it happened, not because I was surveilling Vivian, but because Dominic was careless in a way that suggested he trusted peripheral relationships more than he should have. He sent an email to a shared contact, an interior designer named Romilly, who had done renovation work on a property Vivian and I had updated 2 years earlier. She had a professional relationship with both of us, and tangentially, Dominic's email asked whether she thought the birthday was a good moment or whether he should advise Vivian to wait until September. Romilly forwarded the email to me, not out of loyalty to me in any particular sense, out of discomfort. She had been put in the position of knowing, and the forwarding was her way of extracting herself from the middle of it, transferring the information to the person it most concerned, and removing herself from the equation. I read the email at my desk at Aldercroft on a Tuesday afternoon. Then I forwarded it to Gideon. Then I sat for a while. She was going to serve me divorce papers on my birthday. The symbolism was deliberate. I understood that immediately. The birthday was a statement, designed to mark the occasion with maximum impact, to use the emotional weight of the day as a force multiplier. There was theater in it. The restaurant booking, the occasion, the envelope on the white tablecloth. Dominic had planned this. He had decided, for reasons that were his own, that this was the choreography that served his interests, or Vivian's, which he had decided were his. I thought about that for a moment. Then I thought, she could have the theater, because the theater was all she was going to have. I called Gideon. "She's planning to serve me on my birthday," I said. A pause. The small sound of his teacup being set down. "When?" he said. 3 weeks from Saturday." "I'll have the full file ready by the end of next week," he said. "Good." "You're holding together," he said. It was not quite a question. "Completely," I said. And I was. So I want to be specific about what had been done before I walked into that restaurant, because the specificity is the difference between a story and an instruction. Before the birthday dinner, the following had been completed. Formal documentation establishing that the Aldercroft stake, valued by independent appraisal at £1.4 million, was a pre-marital asset grounded in 9 years of individual professional effort, contracts signed before the marriage, and a shareholders' agreement formally annotated by Hargrove and Associates. The document trail was complete. An independent business appraisal separating pre-marital and marital period growth, establishing that 1.1 million of the total Aldercroft value traced to pre-marital establishment. Just the marital period growth, approximately £300,000, was documented separately, available for negotiation, but no longer pooled with the pre-marital foundation. Formal reclassification of the share package through Hargrove based on its documented pre-marital contractual origin, placing its £240,000 current value outside the immediate marital pool and into a clearly annotated individual holding structure. Complete organized documentation of capital contributions to both jointly held properties, establishing a 68% contribution ratio in my favor based on verifiable bank transfer records going back to the day of purchase. The properties remained joint assets, but the distribution argument was supported by precise documentation. Was clean transfer of £90,000 of personally sourced savings to an individual account, with complete transfer records, rationale notes, and institutional documentation establishing the individual nature of the funds. A retained legal engagement with Gideon at Hargrove, paid from my personal account, who was already in possession of the complete asset register, the appraisals, the annotated contracts, and the contribution analysis. When the papers arrived, they would not be discovering this information for the first time. Everything legitimately Vivian's remained accessible. The jointly purchased properties were still jointly owned. The joint accounts had not been cleared. Nothing had been hidden in any legal sense. What had been done was simpler and more powerful than hiding. Everything that was legitimately mine was clearly, documentably, legibly mine. In an uncontested opening position, the typical negotiation for a 4-year marriage with no children, both parties professionally active, would have started from a marital pool that, without documentation, could have appeared to include the Aldercroft growth, the share package, and the accumulated savings. A competent opposing team, working from that uninformed picture, would have built an opening position in the range of £600,000 to £1 million in her favor. With the documentation in place, the actual marital pool was accurately and significantly smaller. The jointly purchased properties with documented contribution ratios, the joint accounts, the modest shared investment portfolio. Gideon had estimated, in our last meeting before the birthday, is that a negotiated settlement based on the accurate picture would fall in the range of £160,000 to £200,000, her legitimate share of the genuinely joint assets. The difference between an uninformed starting position and a documented one was somewhere between £400,000 and £800,000. That was what the 6 months had been for. The night before my birthday, I slept well. Not as a performance. I actually slept. The preparation was complete. The file was ready. I had read through the complete asset register the previous afternoon in Elena's office, with Gideon present, and at the end of it, Gideon had said, "This is as prepared as I've seen any client in this situation." I told him I'd call within 48 hours of the dinner. He said, "I'll have my phone on." I went home. Just Vivian was already in bed. I went into the kitchen and made tea, a small, deliberate ritual for myself, and sat at the table for 20 minutes in the dark, with the tea and the quiet. The house was very still. The kind of still that a house achieves late at night when everyone in it has stopped moving, when the ambient noise of occupied space falls away and you're left with the actual structure. I had chosen this house with Vivienne. The kitchen had been one of the things that sold me on it. A good proportioned room with a window that faced the garden, which was nothing special, but the light in the mornings was real light, and I had always liked that. I sat in the kitchen I had chosen and drank the tea and said goodbye to the house quietly, in my own head. And then I went to bed. I woke at 6, went to the gym, and came back to a house that smelled like the coffee Vivienne had made. She had a particular brand she was loyal to, a dark roast from a company she'd found years before we met. The smell of it had always been pleasant to me. It still was. I showered. She wished me happy birthday while I was making toast. She kissed my cheek. She was wearing the composed expression she had been wearing for 6 months. The one designed to project normality while carrying the weight of a decision already made. And I recognized it and said nothing about it. "Tonight's going to be perfect," she said. The same phrase, exactly, as the text she'd sent the morning of the original reservation. I had saved that text. It was in the file. "It will be," I said. We arrived at the restaurant at 8. And it was a place I would not have chosen for myself. Too much ambient performance in the decor, the lighting calibrated for atmosphere rather than clarity. The tables were close. Everything was designed to create intimacy, which is a fine design intention, except when the intimacy is between two people who are not, in any functional sense, intimate anymore. We were seated in a booth near the back. The waiter brought water and menus, and Vivienne studied hers with the deliberateness of someone filling time. She had already decided what she was ordering. The menu study was a holding action. I noticed the bag. She had positioned it under her chair rather than on the hook provided at the side of the table. The hook was there for exactly this purpose. A restaurant that had considered how to manage bags had included a small hook, and she had not used it. The bag was under the chair, accessible, the clasp within reach of her right hand. I noticed this and said nothing. I ordered the lamb. She ordered the duck confit. We had wine, a bottle she chose, a red I did not particularly like, but which she preferred, and I said nothing about that either. For the first 90 minutes, we talked about the kinds of things people in our situation, two people who had not yet formally acknowledged what was happening, talk about at dinner. A renovation project I was managing. A weekend she was planning with friends. A conversation about which I observed with interest, because the friends she named were real friends of hers, and she would presumably continue to have this life. A film we had both seen separately in the preceding months and had not yet discussed. I watched her closely, without appearing to watch her. This was a skill I had always had, the ability to track a room while appearing engaged with a single conversation. Architects develop it. You need to be able to read a space and the people in it simultaneously, hold the whole picture in your peripheral attention while focusing on the task in front of you. She was rehearsing. The small signs were there if you knew what to look for. A slightly elevated frequency of pausing before she spoke. A tendency to trail off and refocus, as if checking a mental script. As at one point she touched her hair in a way that was not habitual, not a nervous tic she'd always had, but a new one, the product of the last few weeks. She was managing herself, keeping herself close to the prepared version of this evening. The main course arrived. We ate. The conversation continued without major incident. The food was good. I noted this with the small, specific pleasure that good food produces regardless of circumstances. The lamb was correctly cooked, the juice was clean, and not too sweet. Small mercies. The plates were cleared. And then, as the table was being reset for dessert, she reached under the chair. The envelope was white. Thick paper, the kind used in legal documents and formal communications, the weight of it communicating gravity before a word was read. Yet she placed it on the table between us with a precision that was the product of rehearsal. Not an aggressive gesture, calibrated to seem sad but certain. The gesture of someone doing something difficult but necessary. "I need you to look at that," she said. I looked at it. Then I looked at her. "Adrian." A pause. "I'm sorry. I know it's your birthday, but I think it's better to be honest than to wait." The cadence of that last line was not hers. It had been constructed, practiced. I had heard her speak for 4 years. I knew the natural rhythm of her sentences, and this was not it. This was borrowed language, given to her by someone who had told her it would be the right thing to say. I picked up the envelope. The paper had weight. The texture of it was smooth, cool. My name was on the front in her handwriting. Chartreux. Her handwriting I recognized. She formed her A's with a particular elongated top stroke that I had noticed years ago, early in the relationship, on a note she'd left on the kitchen counter. I set the envelope back down. I looked at her for a moment. I allowed the moment to exist without filling it. A long breath. The ambient sound of the restaurant. Low music, scattered conversation, the specific acoustic quality of a room designed to absorb sound without deadening it, continued around us as if nothing was happening. And then I smiled. Not a performance, or not a dishonest one. It was the smile of a man who has reached a destination after a very long walk and finds the destination is exactly what he expected. "I know," I said. She blinked. Whatever she had been preparing for, tears or anger, or the stricken silence of a man whose evening is being demolished. It was not this. "I've known for 6 months," I said quietly. Not meanly. Simply as a statement of fact, the same tone I might have used to confirm a project timeline. She opened her mouth, closed it. I watched her recalibrate. The rehearsed version of this conversation had assumed a specific response from me, and I had not produced it. The script required a particular kind of Adrian, and I had turned up as a different one, and she did not know what to do with that. "You knew," she said. Not a question. Processing. "I knew," I said. I picked up my wine glass, finished the last of the wine. It was fine, the wine, whatever I thought of her taste in it, and set the glass down carefully on the tablecloth. "You should speak to your solicitor before you go any further with that." I gestured briefly toward the envelope. "Tell them to contact Gideon at Hargrove and Associates. They'll have everything they need." I stood up. I adjusted my jacket. I put enough cash on the table for the bill and the tip. I had planned for this, withdrawn the precise amount that morning, because I was not going to fumble with a card or wait for the bill in this moment, and I was not going to leave without paying. And I looked at her one more time. She was very still. The composed expression had dissolved, and what was underneath it was not anger and not grief. It was a specific kind of confusion, the confusion of someone whose careful plan has made contact with a reality it did not account for. "Happy birthday to me," I said. And I walked out. But the night air outside the restaurant was cool. Late July, but the evening had turned. I stood on the pavement for a moment, my hands in my jacket pockets, and felt the temperature on my face. I had not arranged a car in advance, a small miscalculation in the choreography. The restaurant was not in a part of the city where cabs were immediately available, and I walked for approximately 10 minutes before I found a busier road where one appeared. Those 10 minutes were useful. The physical movement of walking, the specific sensation of pavement through the soles of shoes, the sound of the city at 9:30 on a summer evening, did something that sitting still could not. Not relief, exactly. More like resolution. The close of a long, open loop. The end of something that had, in a specific sense, already ended months earlier, but had continued running in parallel with its own conclusion. The loop closing had a physical sensation, like the release of a tension you have held for so long that you stopped noticing it until it was gone. My phone buzzed in my pocket. Vivian. I did not answer it. It buzzed again. I did not answer. A text arrived. Adrian, please, can we talk? That wasn't how I wanted this to go. I thought about that phrase. Not how she'd wanted it to go. The want had always been about the outcome for herself, the presentation, the managed exit that preserved a particular version of the story. She had wanted to make the theater work, and I had declined to be the audience for it. I got in the cab and gave the driver my address. I called Gideon from the back seat. It was 11:15 in the evening. And he answered on the second ring, as he had said he would. She served? He said. Tonight, I said. We can expect the formal papers within the week. I'll have Elena pull the full register first thing tomorrow, he said. You're in exactly the position we intended. Good, I said. Get some sleep, he said. I put the phone away and watched the city move past the window. Amber streetlights and lit shop fronts and the particular quality of a city at night when the activity has thinned to the kind of people who are out, because they choose to be rather than because the day requires it. I got home. I made tea. I sat at the kitchen table for 20 minutes. Then I went to bed and slept without difficulty. The formal papers arrived on a Wednesday, 7 days after the restaurant. Her solicitor was from a firm in the city, competent. Gideon told me, working from the standard playbook, which meant they had assembled an asset inventory based on whatever information Vivian had been able to provide from memory and direct knowledge. That inventory reflected the picture as it had appeared some time ago, before 6 months of documentation had changed the legibility of the landscape. The figures her team was working from were, in several key respects, significantly larger than the figures the documentation supported. Gideon reviewed the filing over the course of a morning. He called me that afternoon. They've listed the Aldercroft growth as a potential marital asset, he said. They've included the share package, as their estimated total marital pool is approximately £1.1 million. And the documentation we have? Completely contradicts their figures on every contested point, he said. The Aldercroft stake has a formally annotated pre-marital foundation. The share package has its pre-marital contractual basis documented. The contribution ratios on the properties are evidenced. The savings transfer has a complete paper trail. A pause. The sound of a document being shifted. They'll figure this out quickly once we disclose. Their opening position isn't going to survive the first round of disclosure. There's no argument available to them that the documentation doesn't answer. How quickly do we disclose? Immediately, he said. We want this to move. The sooner they see the numbers, the sooner they have a realistic view of what the negotiation is. What do we offer? We discussed the structure. I had decided, in the week since the birthday dinner, that I was not interested in punishing Vivian financially. The preparation I had done was not punitive. It was accurate. What was legitimately hers was her documented share of what was genuinely joint. 50% of the net proceeds from the 2 buy-to-let properties, adjusted for the contribution ratio, plus her share of the joint accounts and the joint investment portfolio. The combined figure, at accurate current valuations, structured correctly, was £172,000. Gideon communicated the offer. The response from Vivian's solicitor arrived 10 days later. Her team had received the disclosure package. They had reviewed it. What the initial figures they had been working from were, as Gideon had predicted, not sustainable in light of the documentation. The asset register, the annotated contracts, the business appraisal, the contribution analysis, each document answered a different element of the position they had assembled, and taken together, they answered it completely. They requested an additional week for their client to review. Gideon told me, "She's seeing the numbers for the first time. Not what she expected." I thought about that conversation, Vivian sitting across from her solicitor, being told that the opening assumption of 1.1 million had collapsed, on contact with the disclosure, to a genuine negotiation around 172,000. I thought about the specific feeling of a strategy encountering a counter-preparation it had not anticipated, as I did not linger on it. "What does she actually need, practically?" I said. "A place to live, initial stability." "She owns half of 2 investment properties," Gideon said. "When those are sold, she'll have capital. In the meantime—" "Make sure the timeline for sale is reasonable," I said. "I'm not blocking access to what's legitimately hers. I want those properties listed and sold and distributed as quickly as the process allows. No delays from my side." Gideon made a note. "You're being very measured about this," he said. "She made her choices," I said. "I'm making mine." While the legal process moved forward, something else developed that I had not anticipated. Dominic. I had not intended to do anything about Dominic directly. He was, in my assessment, a secondary figure, significant to Vivian, irrelevant to me. My preparation had been about the financial structure of the dissolution, not about the man she had chosen to conduct it around. But Dominic made a decision that changed that assessment. 3 weeks after the birthday dinner, I received a call from a development contact named Bertrand, who had been involved in a project Aldercroft had completed the previous year. He was a senior figure at a property development group that was in active discussion with us about a substantial new contract, a residential development that would have been one of the largest commissions Aldercroft had taken on. Bertrand told me, in the measured tone of someone conveying uncomfortable information professionally, that he had received an anonymous message suggesting there were questions about my conduct on the previous project. No specifics, just a suggestion, and a planted seed of uncertainty, the kind that is designed not to make an accusation, but to introduce doubt. Bertrand said he did not, as a rule, give weight to anonymous communications, but he thought I should know. I thanked him. I sat with the information for 24 hours. I did not react immediately. I noted it, as I had noted other things. Then I had a brief conversation with the member of Aldercroft's team, who managed our digital communications infrastructure. He was technically precise and discreet. I asked him to examine the metadata available from the anonymous message. It had been sent from a device registered to Wyndham Studio. Dominic. This required a different tool. The anonymous message to Bertrand was not, on its own, immediately actionable in a legal sense. It was thin, an implication, not a direct defamation. Thus, the connection to Dominic was documented but not publicly established. A direct legal complaint would have taken time and drawn attention to a dispute that I preferred to resolve quietly. What I needed was leverage. A different kind, applied precisely. I had Elena run a financial and professional background review on Wyndham Studio. 2 days' work. She was efficient. What she found was not dramatic in itself, but it was precise enough to matter. Wyndham Studio had 4 active client contracts. 2 of those clients were also clients of Aldercroft. Overlapping professional relationships in a network that was, as most industry networks are, smaller than it appears from the outside. One of those clients, a development group, had engaged Wyndham for residential interior work on a project for which Aldercroft was the primary architect. Also, the engagement had not been disclosed to Aldercroft. More significantly, it had not been disclosed to the development group, who operated under a standard consultant engagement policy requiring declaration of overlapping relationships. This was not illegal, but it was a non-disclosure with contractual implications. The development group's policy was clear. Their consultants were expected to declare overlapping engagements at the point of contract. The Wyndham engagement documentation did not include such a declaration. I had our contract manager pull the relevant documentation. The absence of disclosure was confirmed. I did not raise it directly with the development group. I had Gideon draft a formal letter to Wyndham Studio in professional, entirely factual language, noting the overlapping engagement, noting the absence of disclosure, and noting that Aldercroft was currently evaluating whether to raise the matter formally with the development group and with the professional body relevant to Wyndham's area of practice. The letter contained no threat. It described facts and stated that Aldercroft was considering its options. The response came within 48 hours. Dominic called Gideon's office 3 times in a single morning. He did not leave a voicemail on any of the calls. On the 3rd, Gideon's assistant took a message. Gideon returned the call that afternoon. Dominic said quickly that he was prepared to withdraw from the overlapping engagement. He said there had been no intention to cause harm. Gideon said, "My client is also aware of a separate matter, an anonymous communication made to one of his professional contacts. So, we would need clarity on that before we could consider this matter resolved." Dominic said he didn't know what Gideon was referring to. Gideon said calmly, "We have device metadata." A silence, long enough to be its own answer. "There won't be any further communications," Dominic said. "Good," said Gideon, and he ended the call. There's something important to say about why that exchange happened the way it did. I was not interested in Dominic as a target. I was not interested in a public exposure, in a professional destruction campaign, in making his life difficult as an expression of anything personal. Those actions would have consumed time, attention, and emotional energy that I needed elsewhere. What I needed was for the interference to stop. The anonymous message to Bertrand was a pressure tactic, but it had been designed to disrupt the Aldercroft contract at a moment when I was already managing a complicated personal situation, presumably on the theory that additional professional pressure would destabilize me. It had not destabilized me. It had simply required a response. The response I gave was calibrated. It used an existing, documented professional reality, the non-disclosure, to communicate a proportionate counter-message. The message was, I am a professional, and this is my professional domain. I know what you did. I have documentation. The cost of continuing is higher than the cost of stopping. He stopped. The matter was closed. I moved on. This is worth noting as a principle. The most effective leverage is almost always derived from facts that already exist, not from fabricated pressure. I had not manufactured anything, and I had simply identified an existing reality that Dominic had created through his own choices and made him aware that I had identified it. The clean move. Every time. The settlement was reached 44 days after the birthday dinner. Vivian's solicitor communicated acceptance of the structured offer. Her percentage share of the net proceeds from the sale of both properties, adjusted for the contribution ratio, plus her allocation from the joint accounts and shared portfolio. The total, when the properties were valued for listing, came to £178,000, slightly above the initial estimate because the market had moved modestly in the intervening weeks. The properties were listed within 10 days. I spoke to Vivian once during this period, not because the legal process required it. It didn't. She called on a Sunday evening, and I was sitting at my desk reviewing design drawings for a project, and I answered. She said, "I didn't know you'd done all of that." I said, "I know you didn't." A silence. The sound of her breathing. "Was it all planned?" she said. I thought about how to answer that accurately. Planning implies a starting point, and the starting point had been a Tuesday morning at 4:47, with a buzzing phone and a choice between reaction and preparation. "The marriage wasn't planned," I said. "The exit was." She said, "That's cold." I said, "You handed me divorce papers on my birthday." A long silence, the kind that contains something that will not be said because there is nothing useful to say. "I should have handled it differently," she said. Her voice was quiet and specific, not performed this time. "Yes," I said. And that was the end of the conversation. I did not tell her to take care of herself, or wish her well, or offer any of the closing remarks that are supposed to seal a conversation like that. I simply said yes, because it was accurate, and then the conversation was over. I want to be clear about what I am not saying. I am not saying I was blameless in the failure of the marriage. Marriages fail for reasons that are rarely simple and rarely one-sided. I worked long hours. I was absent in ways I did not always recognize as absence at the time. The sustained focus that had built Aldercroft over 9 years, the quality of attention directed at problems until they were solved, the prioritization of the project over the present moment, was not an asset inside a marriage in the way it had been an asset in a partnership. And I have thought about this honestly. I have thought about specific conversations I did not have. Specific evenings I was present in body, but not in attention. The particular way I had assumed that a shared life did not require the same quality of intention as a built thing. That it would sustain itself on the foundation of the early years without regular maintenance. I may have been wrong about that. But the question of my contribution to the failure of the marriage is a separate question from the question of what was mine when the marriage ended. Those questions are different. I can hold both simultaneously. The first is a matter of honesty about the past. The second is a matter of fairness in the present. The preparation I had done was not about punishment. It was about accuracy. Nothing more than that. September came, and the first property sold in 5 weeks, slightly above asking price. The second sold in 8. Both properties had been properly maintained, the listings were clean and well photographed, and the conveyancing moved without complications. The net proceeds were distributed according to the agreement within 2 weeks of each completion. Vivian received her share promptly. I did not delay any part of the process. I received my share. The joint accounts were closed. The shared investment portfolio was liquidated at a favorable moment. Elena had noted a timing opportunity in the market, and I had taken it. And divided according to the agreement. Gideon sent a final confirmation email in the 2nd week of October. The dissolution petition had been formally filed. A date was set for the final order. I read the email at my desk at Aldercroft on a Wednesday morning. The office was quiet. Several of the team were on site for the early stages of the Bertrand development, which had proceeded once the contract was formally signed in mid-September. The office had the particular quality of a space in productive motion, half its people present, and the other half usefully elsewhere. I replied to Gideon, "Thank you. Please send the final invoice to my personal account." I closed the laptop and went to the kitchen along the corridor to get coffee. The kitchen had a window that looked onto a small internal courtyard that the building's conversion had preserved. Someone had planted a Japanese maple in it when the conversion was done, 3 years earlier. It had turned in the October, the deep copper red of the season, specific and temporary, a very still in the windless morning. I stood there with my coffee and looked at it for a while. Not thinking about anything particularly, just looking at the color. In November, I took a week off, the first full week I had taken in 4 years, a fact I had not fully registered until Elena mentioned it in passing, observing a gap in the billing patterns. I went to a coastline I had been meaning to visit for several years. Cliffs and sea, a village with 2 pubs and a bakery, and the particular quality of a small place in autumn that is inhabited by people who chose it specifically, rather than ending up there. I walked for 7 days. Long walks, the kind where the route is irrelevant and the point is the movement. The first 2 days, I thought about the marriage as I had expected to, as the specific memories that surface when you give them space. Vivian, in the first year, at a dinner party at friends, making an argument about urban planning that had surprised the whole table. The particular ease of early mornings in the flat we'd shared before the house. Small, specific, accurate things that had been real. By the 3rd day, I was thinking about other things. The Bertrand development. An architectural problem I had been holding in the background about the structural language of the public realm component that resolved itself on a cliffside walk on the 4th morning in a way that would not have happened at a desk. By the 5th day, I was not thinking about much at all, just walking. The sound of the sea in heavy weather is a specific physical experience. The pressure of it, or the way it fills the air with salt and cold, and something that is not quite sound, more like the memory of sound. And it occupied the space that thoughts usually fill. I ate at the pub each evening. Good local fish. Simply prepared. I read in the evenings. I slept without difficulty. On the last day, I sat on a cliff edge for an hour in the late afternoon, looking at the water moving below, and what I thought was, I am 36 years old. I built something real. I protected what I built. The place I am standing right now is not where I expected to be. But it is not small. That was the full thought. I went back to the village and had dinner. The Bertrand development is in construction now. The site was cleared in March, and the foundations are being laid. Just the structural logic of the design, the specific problem I had resolved on the cliff walk in November, worked well in the technical development phase, and the early construction documentation had a clarity that the team responded to. I visited the site last week, in the early morning, before the main day's work was underway. A construction site at the beginning of things has a particular quality. The smell of turned earth and aggregate, the specific cold of exposed ground in early spring, the sense of everything being potential rather than actual. The project manager, a man I've worked with for 3 years, came over and mentioned that the ground conditions were better than the survey had suggested. I said, "It usually is once you get in." He nodded and went back to the site. I stood for a few more minutes. The sun was coming up behind the building line to the east, and the light was the pale gold of early spring. The kind that does not yet carry warmth, but suggests it might. The site was still, a held breath before the day's work began. There are worse ways to start a morning. I have been asked, since, whether I regret the smile. The question is always framed as if the smile was a cruelty, as if it would have been more appropriate to have responded with visible damage, tears, or silence, or the specific expression of a man whose ground has given way. I don't think that's right. The smile was honest. It said, exactly accurately, that the thing she was doing had not landed the way she had designed it to land. The theater, the birthday, the restaurant, the white envelope, had been constructed on the assumption that I was unprepared, such that the occasion would catch me exposed and the weight of the moment would flatten me. It didn't land that way because I had carried the weight for 6 months and set it down, quietly and precisely, before I arrived at the restaurant. The smile was not cruelty. It was just the truth of the situation, worn on my face. There are things I know now that I will carry forward. The first is that preparation is not paranoia. The 6 months of documentation and financial restructuring were not the actions of a man anticipating failure or operating from distrust. They were the actions of a man who understood that legal and financial processes do not reward those who are most hurt or most right. They reward those who arrive with their documentation in order. The second is that the quiet move is almost always more powerful than the visible one. What the loudest moment in the restaurant that evening was the envelope hitting the table. The most significant moment was 12 weeks earlier in Gideon's office when the final document was annotated and he said, "She's going to be arguing against a wall." Nobody was in the restaurant that evening when the most important thing happened. It had already happened, months before. The third is specific to the domain of financial protection in a marriage, and I will state it directly because this is the part that has practical value beyond one story. If you have built something prior to a marriage, a business, a professional stake, an investment position, an accumulated financial foundation of any kind, the most important thing you can do in the early years of that marriage is formalize the documentation of its pre-marital origin. And not because marriages fail, many do not, but because documents deteriorate in relevance if they are not formally annotated. Memories distort. The absence of a clear, contemporaneous record creates genuine legal ambiguity that is expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally costly to resolve retroactively. The shareholders' agreement that should have existed at Aldercroft from the day it was founded had always been factually accurate. The facts it documented were true on the first day and true on the day Gideon annotated it. But it did not exist in a form that a legal process could use without effort. Making it exist in that form, before any dispute, while everything is clear, was worth, in practical terms, several £100,000. Not because it changed the facts, because it made the facts legible. But every professional who has built something premaritally should read that sentence twice. I think often about what Gideon said in our first meeting. Most men come in here 2 weeks after the fact, when she's already filed and they're operating in reaction. You're here before. That's the entire ballgame. The entire ballgame is the difference between reacting and preparing. Between operating in the fog of an emotional crisis and operating from a position that was structured in the clear months before the crisis arrived. The fog is real. I'm not dismissing it. The grief in the guest room at 11 in the evening in May was real. The specific experience of sitting in a house you chose together and understanding that the shared life you believed you were building was not what you had understood it to be. That is not a small thing, and it cannot be shortened. But the grief and the preparation are not in conflict. You can feel both. You can allow the grief to be real without allowing it to prevent the thinking. The preparation is, in a sense, the most useful thing you can do with the grief. It converts the energy of it into something that functions, something that serves the situation rather than being consumed by it. The man who walks out of the restaurant smiling is not a man who feels nothing. He is a man who felt everything. Earlier, in private, when feeling it was the appropriate thing to do, and who made sure that by the time the envelope landed on the table, everything that could be done had been done. In February, 3 months after the dissolution was finalized, my phone rang from a number I didn't recognize. It was Dominic, and he had not contacted me since the conversation between Gideon and him in September. I was surprised by the call, mildly, in the way you are surprised by things you thought were closed. I answered. He said he wasn't sure why he was calling. He wanted me to know there had been no plan, at the beginning, to harm me specifically. I let that sit for a moment, an honest assessment of its content. This was not an apology designed for my benefit. It was an appeal designed for his. He was looking for something. A response that would let him reframe what had happened as something smaller or more understandable than it had been. I believe you, I said. It doesn't change anything. No, he said. I know. A pause. The ambient sound of wherever he was calling from. She and I aren't. It didn't continue, he said. After everything. Well, we're not together anymore. I thought about why he was telling me this. Not for my benefit. People who tell you the consequences they're experiencing are not sharing information. They're looking for the acknowledgement that the consequences are sufficient. They want to complete the transaction. That's between you and her, I said. Right, he said. There was a moment where he might have said something else, and chose not to. Don't call again, I said. I hung up. I have moved since then. Not far, same city, different part of it. A flat I chose entirely on the basis of my own preferences, without the negotiation and compromise that shared choices require. North-facing windows, which I preferred, and which Vivian had always overruled in favor of the warmer light of south aspects. Bonus a study with enough room for the drafting table I have had since graduate school, which I had kept in storage for 2 years because there was nowhere to put it in the house we had shared. The drafting table is at the window now. The light is diffuse and good. I work at it on weekend mornings, and the quality of thinking that happens at a physical drawing surface is different from the thinking that happens at a screen. The flat is not large, it is not small. It is exactly the size of one person's life, organized for that person's actual preferences, without negotiation. The first night I slept there, I made pasta. The same pasta I used to make on Tuesday evenings in the kitchen of the shared house. I ate it at the kitchen table with a novel, and the pasta tasted exactly like pasta, and the novel was good, and the flat was quiet, in the particular way that a new space is quiet before it accumulates the sounds of being lived in. Simple things have the advantage of being only what they are. There is a specific quality to the work I do that I have always found stabilizing. Architecture is the practice of understanding what a structure can hold. Every decision in a design process is a decision about capacity. How much load? How much stress? In what distribution? Across what span of time? You are always asking, what does this hold and for how long? And what happens when the conditions change? The same question, applied to a different domain, is what the 6 months before the birthday dinner had been about. What could this situation hold, and for how long? And how should the load be distributed so that when the pressure came, should the structure remained intact? I had found the answers. I had distributed the load. And when the envelope landed on the white tablecloth under the ambient jazz and the calibrated restaurant lighting, the structure held without effort. It held perfectly. I did not go back to the restaurant after that evening. I had no particular desire to. The restaurant had been a stage for a scene planned without my participation, or rather, planned around my expected reaction, which had not materialized in the form intended. The stage had been set for a specific performance, and the lead had walked out halfway through the opening line. Whatever came after that, the meal that was no longer a meal, the conversation that was no longer a conversation, the drive home or the phone calls or the subsequent days, I was not there for it. I was already walking. Darturntingham. 10 minutes through a cooling July evening, towards a road where cabs passed, with the city moving around me and the evening ahead, and nothing in my pockets that did not belong there. The performance ran without me. I don't know how it ended. I wasn't there.